By midnight, one badge would be sitting on a metal desk, one department would be facing a federal review, and one video would already have 400,000 views. But at 9:47 p.m., all Renata Voss knew was that a police officer had his finger an inch from the bars, screaming that she would rot in jail. "You want to explain yourself now?" Officer Grant Holloway's voice cracked off the concrete walls of the holding block. "Or are you going to keep giving me that look?" Renata didn't move. She stood inside the cell with her arms loosely at her sides, blazer still buttoned despite the 2 hours she'd already spent in it, and looked at him the way a person looks at weather they've already decided not to argue with. "I've told you everything I'm authorized to tell you," she said quietly. "If you'd verified my credentials before processing me, we wouldn't be standing here." Authorized. Holloway repeated the word like it tasted wrong in his mouth. "Lady, you were standing outside a restricted perimeter at 9 o'clock at night, refusing to answer basic questions. That's not authorization. That's suspicious." Behind him, Officer Miles Cordero shifted his weight against the doorframe, saying nothing, his eyes moving between his training officer and the woman behind the bars, like he was watching two different versions of the same event collide. 90 minutes earlier, it had been almost nothing. A patrol car rolling past the Meridian Municipal Annex, a squat grey building that housed nothing more exciting than water department records, and, on the third floor, a server room nobody thought twice about, and a woman standing near the loading dock with a tablet in one hand, tracing something along the exterior wall with the other. Holloway had pulled up, expecting a vagrant. What he found was a woman in business clothes, who, when asked what she was doing, said only, "I'm here on a scheduled assessment. I can't discuss the details, but the building manager's office has documentation." It was a strange answer, but not an illegal one. "Ma'am, I need you to explain what you're doing at a restricted facility after hours." "I understand the question," Renata had said, and that was the first mistake Holloway made, though he wouldn't recognize it as one. Until much later, he heard understand and not answer, and something in him bristled at being handled instead of obeyed. "That's not what I asked. I know. I'm telling you I can confirm I have legitimate authorization here, but I'm not able to disclose the specifics tonight. If you call the number on the building's after-hours contact placard, they'll verify it in under 2 minutes. It would have taken 2 minutes." Cordero would remember that detail for a long time, how close they'd come, how simple it would have been, how his training officer had looked at the placard bolted to the wall 6 feet away and decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with the woman standing in front of him and everything to do with the reprimand sitting in his personnel file from 3 weeks earlier, that he wasn't going to be told what to do by someone who wouldn't just answer the question. "You're not able to disclose," Holloway repeated, stepping closer. "Or you don't have anything to disclose. Those aren't the same thing, officer." That was when his jaw had tightened the way Cordero had learned to recognize, the tell that came right before Holloway stopped listening entirely. "Hands behind your back. You don't have to do this," Renata said, and there was no fear in it, only something closer to disappointment. "You have a much easier option, sitting right there on that wall. Hands behind your back." She hadn't fought it, hadn't raised her voice. She'd simply turned, laced her fingers together, and let the cuffs close around her wrists, with the calm of someone who had done this kind of math before and already knew how it would end, just not how long it would take to get there. A jogger had slowed near the corner, phone rising halfway, before dropping again, when nothing more dramatic seemed to be happening. A woman walking a dog had paused at the crosswalk, watching a little too long before continuing on. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. There's a particular kind of silence that isn't peace. It's permission, and Renata had felt it settle over the sidewalk the moment the cuffs clicked shut. Now, in the holding block, Holloway was still going, louder because she wasn't matching him, and Cordero was starting to understand that the volume wasn't for her anymore. It was for himself. "You people always think there's some magic phrase that gets you out of trouble," Holloway said. "Restricted assessment, can't disclose. You know how many times I've heard that line?" "I don't think you have," Renata said. "Not like this." Something about the stillness in her voice made Cordero's stomach turn over slowly, the way it did right before a call went bad, in a way you couldn't take back. Holloway laughed, short and humorless, and turned toward the door like the conversation was already over, already won. "Enjoy the night," he said. "Judge sees you Monday." Maybe by then you'll remember how to answer a simple question. Renata didn't call after him. She waited until his footsteps had faded down the corridor before she looked up at the clock mounted above the booking desk, visible through the narrow window in the cell door, and said, quiet enough that only Cordero, still lingering by the frame, could hear it. 4 minutes. He frowned. 4 minutes for what? She held his gaze for a long moment, and for the first time all night, something that might have been sympathy crossed her face, not for herself, but for him. You're about to find out, she said. And I'd start thinking now about what you're going to say when they ask you why you didn't make that call. Down the hallway, at the front desk, the phone was already ringing. Before we go any further, subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and keep watching, because what happens next changes everything. The phone had rung 4 times before anyone answered it. Priya Deshmukh, the night desk clerk, picked it up on the 5th ring with the flat, practiced tone of someone who'd fielded 1,000 wrong numbers and expected this to be the 1,001st. Meridian PD, front desk. This is Trellis Security Operations, calling regarding a check-in failure for contractor badge 4419. Can you confirm whether an individual named Renata Voss is currently in your custody? Priya's pen paused above the log sheet. I'm sorry, who is this? Trellis Security Operations. We monitor scheduled site assessments for several federal and municipal contracts. Ms. Voss missed a mandatory 90-minute check-in at the Meridian Annex approximately 40 minutes ago. Our system flagged her last known location as your patrol unit's position. Priya glanced toward the holding block, where the overhead light hummed against the quiet. Yes, she's here. She was brought in for, is she safe? The question landed strangely. Not what's she charged with, not when will she be released, just, is she safe? She's fine, Priya said slowly. She's in a cell. There was a pause on the line, brief but audible. The kind of pause that told Priya someone on the other end was writing something down. Understood. Please advise your supervising officer that a failure to reach Miss Voss within the next hour will trigger an automatic escalation to her contracting authority. That's simply how the protocol works. Thank you for confirming her status. The line went dead before Priya could ask anything else. She sat there a moment, phone still in her hand, replaying the words. Contracting authority. Escalation. She'd worked the desk for 6 years and had never once heard a call like that. Not for a DUI, not for a domestic, not even for the county commissioner's DUI last spring, which had generated plenty of strange phone calls, but none of them this calm, this procedural, this certain. She got up and walked back toward the booking area, where Holloway was leaning against the counter, finishing a form with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who considered his night's work done. Officer Holloway. She caught herself. He wasn't a sergeant, hadn't been for 3 weeks, not since the reprimand, but old habits from before the demotion still slipped out sometimes and he never corrected them. I just got a strange call about the woman in holding. Holloway didn't look up. What kind of strange? Some private security company. Said she missed a check-in for a contract. Asked if she was safe. That got his attention, but not the way Priya expected. He smirked, capped his pen, and shook his head like she'd told him a joke. Private security company, he repeated. You know how many of those exist? Half of them are some guy with a laptop and a website. She probably works for a rent-a-cop outfit that patrols parking garages and wants everybody to think it's the CIA. He slid the form toward her. Log it and file it. If it's real, they'll call the actual courthouse in the morning. Priya hesitated. They said an hour, and then it escalates to her, Priya. He said her name the way he said most things now, with the particular weariness of a man trying to remind everyone, including himself, that he still outranked the room even if the paperwork said otherwise. I've been doing this 22 years. People throw around scary-sounding words to get out of trouble. That's the oldest trick there is. He walked off toward the break room, and Priya stood there for a moment, the log sheet in her hand, before she went back to her desk and did exactly what he told her to do. She didn't see Cordero standing in the hallway, close enough to have heard all of it, his jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. The second call came 19 minutes later, And this time it wasn't Priya who answered. Holloway grabbed it himself, mostly to prove a point. Meridian PD. This is Colonel Faraday Reyes, Army Corps of Engineers Liaison Office. I need to speak with whoever is currently holding Renata Voss. Holloway's smirk didn't fade immediately. It took him a second, one full second longer than it should have, to register that the voice on the other end wasn't asking. It was informing. That'll be me, he said, dragging the words out, still performing for an audience that wasn't there anymore. And who exactly are you again? I'll repeat it once. Army Corps of Engineers, Liaison Office. Miss Voss is under federal contract, conducting a scheduled infrastructure security review of a facility your department is apparently unaware requires federal clearance to approach. Her detainment has interrupted an active assessment window that cannot simply be rescheduled. I need her released, and I need to know the specific charges filed against her. Holloway's mouth opened, then shut. Something in his chest, small, unfamiliar, unwelcome, tightened. She was uncooperative during a legitimate stop, he said, and heard, for the first time that night, how thin the sentence sounded out loud. Define uncooperative. She wouldn't answer my questions directly. There was a silence on the line long enough that Holloway almost said hello to check the call hadn't dropped. When the voice returned, it had changed, not louder, but colder. The way still water gets colder the deeper you go. Officer, I'd advise you to write down everything you just told me, word for word, because you are going to be asked to repeat it very soon, and to people considerably less patient than I am. The line clicked off. Holloway stood at the desk holding the receiver a beat too long before setting it down. Down the hall, through the narrow window in the cell door, Renata Voss hadn't moved, still sitting with her hands folded, the fluorescent light catching the calm, unreadable line of her jaw. As though she'd already heard both calls from 30 feet away and found nothing in them worth reacting to. Cordero appeared in the doorway of the break room, arms crossed, watching him. You want to tell me what that was? He asked quietly. Holloway didn't answer right away. He was still staring down the hall at the cell, at the woman who hadn't so much as glanced up, and for the first time since the traffic stop began, the small, cold seed of doubt he'd have laughed off an hour ago had started, unmistakably, to grow. The phone on the desk began ringing again. Neither of them moved to pick it up right away. Cordero picked it up before Holloway could stop him. Meridian PD, holding division. The voice on the other end didn't introduce a title or an agency this time. It didn't need to. This is a courtesy call, it said. In 11 minutes, 3 vehicles are going to arrive at your station. When they do, whoever is in charge of that building needs to have every piece of paperwork related to tonight's arrest sitting on a desk, untouched, unaltered, and ready to be handed over. That is the only instruction I'm going to give you. Do you understand? Cordero's grip on the receiver tightened. Yes, sir. Good. The line went dead. Cordero set the phone down slowly, like it might go off again if he moved too fast, and turned to find Holloway already watching him from across the desk, some of the color gone out of his face. 11 minutes, Cordero said. They said 11 minutes. Holloway laughed, but it came out wrong, thinner than he meant it, missing the certainty that had carried him through the last 2 hours. Somebody's messing with us. This is some kind of prank call chain. Happens all the time. 3 calls in 20 minutes isn't a prank, Grant. Cordero rarely used his first name. He used it now on purpose. You need to think about what you actually have on her, not what you feel like you have. What you can put in a report and defend. Holloway didn't answer. He was staring past Cordero, down the corridor, at the cell where Renata Voss sat exactly as she had for the last 2 hours, unmoving, unbothered, her eyes now fixed not on the wall clock but on the window near the front entrance, as though she already knew what was about to pull into the lot before anyone else in the building did. She was right. At 10:41 p.m., 3 black SUVs turned off Meridian Boulevard without using their turn signals, rolled through the empty visitor lot, and parked in a formation that had nothing accidental about it. One blocking the exit, one squared to the front doors, one held back at an angle that gave a clear line of sight to every window in the building. No lights, no sirens, just the low, disciplined hum of engines cutting out almost in unison. Priya, watching from the front desk, felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear of trouble, and everything to do with the sudden physical certainty that trouble had already arrived and simply hadn't announced itself yet.
"Grant," she said, "you need to come up here." Inside her cell, Renata allowed herself, for the first time all night, something close to a breath of relief. Not because she was afraid. Because she hadn't been, not once, not through any of it, but because the part of her job that required staying calm in front of people who didn't understand what they were interrupting was, mercifully, about to end.
The doors of the SUVs opened together, and the people who stepped out moved the way people move when arriving somewhere is never in question, only how much time it takes them to fix what's wrong once they get there. A woman in a charcoal blazer led the group, federal credentials already visible, clipped and squared at her hip, like she'd done this so many times the motion had stopped requiring thought. She reached the front doors before Holloway had even made it to the front desk. "I'm looking for whoever authorized the detention of Renata Voss," she said, not raising her voice, not needing to. Holloway straightened, old instinct, the last reflex of 22 years of being the loudest person in most rooms he walked into. "That'd be me, Officer Grant Holloway. And you are?" "Special Agent Dana Okafor, Defense Security Cooperation Division." She held her badge up long enough for him to actually read it, not just glance. Miss Voss was conducting a scheduled infrastructure assessment on a facility under federal review. Her check-in failure triggered a mandatory response protocol. I need to know exactly what she was charged with, and I need to know it now. Holloway's jaw worked for a second before the words came out, and when they did, they came out with the same defiant pride they always had, because some part of him still believed, even now, even with 3 vehicles parked outside his station, that explaining himself clearly would be enough to make this go away. She refused to answer basic questions during a lawful stop near a restricted perimeter, he said, wouldn't identify her purpose, wouldn't cooperate. I arrested her for obstruction. Agent Okafor didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. Behind her, a second agent already had a tablet out, recording every word. You arrested a federal contractor, she said slowly, for declining to disclose classified assessment details to a municipal patrol officer at a checkpoint she was authorized to be at. Is that an accurate summary, Officer Holloway? For the first time that night, Holloway heard his own justification the way it would sound to someone who hadn't been standing on that sidewalk 2 hours ago, and something in his chest went cold and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I signed the arrest report, he said, because it was the only thing left he knew how to say, and some stubborn, wounded part of him still wanted credit for it. I stand by it. Agent Okafor looked at him for a long moment, the kind of silence that does more work than any accusation could. You may want to reconsider that, she said, because in about 90 seconds you're going to find out exactly what facility she was assessing tonight, and what almost happened there because she wasn't where she was supposed to be. Behind her, through the glass partition, Renata Voss rose from the bench for the first time in 2 hours, straightened her blazer, and looked directly at Holloway with an expression that wasn't triumph. It was something closer to finally. If you're enjoying the story, hit like, subscribe, and comment below, because what happens next is something nobody at that station saw coming. Now, let's get back to the story. Agent Okafor didn't raise her voice. She never had to. The Meridian Annex isn't a water records building, Officer Holloway, she said, opening a slim folder and turning it so he could see the first page without handing it to him. Not entirely. The 3rd floor houses a relay node for regional emergency communications, the kind of infrastructure that gets quietly checked every few months by people who are supposed to look like they're not checking anything at all. That's the job. Mrs. Voss was 2 hours into a 4-hour assessment when your patrol car pulled up. Holloway's eyes moved to the page without really reading it. She could have just told me that. She's not authorized to tell you that. That's the entire point of the assessment. It works because nobody, including the officers patrolling the block, knows it's happening. You weren't supposed to notice her. The fact that you did wasn't a failure on her part, officer. It was a success. Right up until you decided a woman calmly declining to explain herself was a threat instead of doing exactly what she was trained to do. Cordero, standing near the doorway, felt something in his stomach twist. The private, sick recognition of a moment he could have stopped and hadn't. When she missed her check-in, Okafor continued. The system assumed the worst. Compromise. Injury. Abduction. It doesn't have a category for arrested by the police, for asking to see credentials before answering questions. So it escalated, automatically, all the way up. And every person who answered a phone in this building tonight had a chance to stop that escalation, with one phone call to the number on the placard bolted 6 feet from where you put handcuffs on her. She closed the folder. Nobody made that call. I didn't know, Holloway said, and his voice had lost the edge it carried 2 hours ago. Had lost, Cordero realized, almost everything it carried 2 hours ago. That's exactly the problem, Okafor said. You didn't ask. You had an easy option sitting on the wall, and a woman standing in front of you who told you, twice, that it existed. You chose not to use it because she wouldn't give you what you wanted the way you wanted it. Holloway looked past her, down the hall, to where Renata stood now on the other side of the glass, arms loosely crossed, watching without satisfaction. Watching, Cordero thought. The way you watch weather finally break after you've stood in it too long. She's fine, Holloway said, weaker now, grasping. Nothing happened. She's not hurt. No, Okafor agreed. She's not. That's not because of anything you did right tonight. That's because she's good at her job, and because the backup contingency for a missed check-in didn't require anyone to get hurt to activate. She held out her hand. Badge and weapon, Officer Holloway. You're relieved of duty effective immediately, pending a full review. For a moment, Holloway didn't move, his hand hovering near his belt the way a man's hand hovers near something he's worn so long he's forgotten it's removable. This is my station, he said, but it came out smaller than he meant it to. The last threadbare scrap of the man who'd stood on that sidewalk 2 hours ago, certain he held every card in the room. It was Cordero who finally stepped forward. Grant, quiet, not unkind. Just give it to her. Something about hearing it from his own trainee. The kid he'd spent 3 years half mentoring, half bissing, seemed to reach a part of Holloway that Okafor's calm authority hadn't. Slowly he unclipped the badge, set it on the counter, and unbuckled the holster with hands that had begun, faintly, to shake. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything left to say. Across the room, Renata accepted a cup of water someone finally thought to offer her. And when Okafor approached to ask if there was anything she wanted done differently, Renata only shook her head. I want it handled correctly, she said. That's all. Not vindication, not revenge, just correctly. Okafor nodded, understanding. Immediately that this wasn't a woman who needed to watch Holloway suffer, to feel like the night had ended right. But the night wasn't finished with him yet. As two agents began pulling booking footage and Cordero's body cam audio for the file, Priya, still at the front desk, still turning the last 2 hours over in her mind, found something in the county's personnel archive she hadn't thought to look for until now. 2 prior complaints against Holloway, both closed without action, both involving the exact same pattern. A raised voice, a refusal to verify, a tone mistaken for a threat. She printed both and set them without a word on the growing stack in front of Agent Okafor. Okafor read the first page, then the second, and something in her expression didn't change so much as settle, the look of someone confirming a suspicion rather than discovering a surprise. This wasn't tonight, she said quietly, mostly to herself. This was just the night someone finally noticed. Outside, through the front windows, Holloway was being walked to a waiting car, not in cuffs, not yet, but escorted all the same, past the 3 black SUVs still parked in their silent formation, past the small cluster of officers who'd gathered near the break room, and now found they couldn't quite meet his eyes. He didn't look back. The Internal Affairs Review took 11 weeks. Renata Voss sat for exactly 1 interview, answered every question, in the same measured voice she'd used in the holding cell, and declined every reporter who called afterward. The story broke anyway. Priya's printed pages, Cordero's body camera audio, and the 3 circulating bystander videos did the work no press conference could have. What the review found didn't stay contained to one night. 2 earlier complaints against Grant Holloway resurfaced from a drawer where they'd been quietly filed and forgotten. A delivery driver detained for attitude. After asking why he'd been stopped, a teenager held for 40 minutes for the crime of not making eye contact fast enough. Neither complaint had gone anywhere the first time. Both did now. The county's oversight board opened a review of every arrest Holloway had personally documented over the previous 6 years.
Most held up. 14 did not, and one of those 14 belonged to a woman named Carla Jimenez, who had spent a night in a cell 4 years earlier for the same offense as Renata, declining to explain herself fast enough for an officer who'd already decided what her silence meant. She got a formal apology, a corrected record, and, for the first time since it happened, someone in a position of authority telling her plainly that she had been right and the department had been wrong. Holloway didn't fight the plea agreement his attorney eventually negotiated. Loss of certification, permanent bar from law enforcement in the state, no criminal time, the calculus of a man whose 30 years of reading people had in the end been read correctly by everyone else long before he understood it himself. He gave no statement to the cameras still occasionally parked outside his house. His attorney had advised silence, and for the first time in longer than either of them could say, Holloway actually listened. Cordero stayed on. Under the interim command that followed, he was the first to volunteer for the new verification protocol the department adopted. A simple rule, embarrassingly simple in hindsight, requiring any officer questioning someone's stated authorization to make the confirming phone call before escalating, not after. He kept a printed copy of his own body camera transcript in his desk drawer for a long time, not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder of the 4 minutes where he'd known something was wrong and said nothing loud enough. Priya kept doing the job she'd always done, except now there was a laminated card taped beside her phone with a single line she'd written herself. When in doubt, make the call. Meridian's new interim chief, a career administrator named Adais Bello, who had spent most of her career in oversight rather than patrol, gave one public statement that didn't try to soften what had happened. She said the department had failed, that the failure had a pattern behind it, and that fixing a pattern took longer than firing one man, but that the work would continue whether or not anyone was still watching by the time it finished. It wasn't a triumphant speech. It wasn't meant to be. It was honest, and in a department that hadn't heard much honesty from its own leadership in a long time, that counted for something. 8 months later, Renata found herself driving past the Meridian Annex on her way to an unrelated assessment 2 counties over. She hadn't planned to stop. But the building looked different in daylight than it had that night. Smaller, almost unremarkable. The kind of grey municipal block nobody looks at twice, which she supposed had always been the point. She parked anyway. Cordero was outside on a break when he recognized her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence carrying more than either of them probably intended it to. "I wasn't sure you'd ever come back through here," he said finally. "I wasn't sure either," Renata admitted. "I think I wanted to see if it still felt the same." "Does it?" She considered the question the way she considered most things, carefully, without performing an answer for his benefit. "No," she said. "It feels like a place that's still figuring itself out. That's not nothing." Cordero glanced back toward the doors, then at her, some old unresolved weight visibly still sitting on him. "I keep thinking about the 4 minutes," he said. "How I knew. How I didn't do anything with knowing." "You did something 2 hours later," Renata said. "That's more than most people manage the first time." It wasn't absolution, and she hadn't offered it as one. But something in the way she said it seemed to loosen something in him anyway, the particular relief of being told, by the person with the most right to withhold it, that a mistake didn't have to be the whole story. "For what it's worth," he said, "the new check-in protocol we use, it's got your incident number attached to the training file. Every new officer reads it. Not with your name. Just the situation. What should have happened at minute 4 instead of minute 120. Renata looked toward the building for a long moment, the afternoon light catching flat and gold against its grey face, unremarkable, the way it was always supposed to look. "Good," she said quietly. "That's what actually matters. Not what happened to me, what happens to the next person standing where I was standing." She got back in her car, and Cordero watched her pull out of the lot and merge onto the boulevard, unhurried, the way she'd moved through every version of that night, never rushing toward vindication, only ever waiting for the truth to catch up to where she'd already been standing the whole time. What happened in Meridian that night was never really about one officer or one arrest. It was about how easily authority curdles into abuse when no one is required to check it,
and how long that abuse can survive when everyone around it decides silence is safer than speaking up. Renata Voss never raised her voice, never demanded an apology, never asked anyone to suffer for what was done to her, and that restraint was the point. Dignity held quietly under pressure outlasts arrogance every time, because arrogance needs an audience to survive, and dignity doesn't. The real justice in this story wasn't Holloway losing his badge. It was a rookie officer somewhere reading a training file with no name attached to it, learning to make one phone call before making one assumption, proof that a single person's refusal to be diminished can, eventually, protect people who will never know her name. Thank you for staying with this one through to the end. If Renata's calm meant something to you, if you found yourself angry for her and then quietly relieved for Cordero, hit like. It tells me stories like this one are worth telling. Subscribe if you want more stories about dignity outlasting pride, and share this with someone who still believes the truth is worth waiting for.